Imagine waking up one morning and realizing NATO troops have been deployed, not to stop Russia, not to confront China, but because of the President of the United States. No missiles launched, no invasion announced, no declaration of war, just a slow, dangerous escalation almost nobody saw coming. And here's the part that should unsettle you the most. If America's closest allies are preparing for America, what does that mean for the rest of us? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why the Greenland story isn't about ice, territory, or even diplomacy. It's about power, it's about fear, and it's about a world quietly preparing for instability coming from Washington itself. For a brief moment, the headlines sounded like satire, like a poorly written political thriller that went too far. And yet, here we are. NATO troops on the ground in Greenland, not because Greenland asked for protection from an external enemy, not because a hostile power made a move, but because rhetoric, pressure, and escalating threats from Donald Trump crossed a line that allies could no longer ignore. This didn't happen overnight. At first, Trump's comments about Greenland were treated as a joke. Then they were reframed as negotiation tactics. Then they were excused as bluster. Until they weren't. Because when Donald Trump publicly declared that anything short of U.S. control of Greenland was unacceptable, the joke died. And when European defense officials quietly began coordinating deployments under the banner of joint exercises, the message was unmistakable. This alliance was no longer planning only for threats from the outside. It was planning for uncertainty coming from within. Greenland is not empty land. It is home to more than 60,000 people. It has its own elected government. Its people have the same right to self-determination as any other nation. And yet, they suddenly found themselves reduced to a talking point in a geopolitical fantasy driven not by strategy, but by ego. When Greenland's prime minister was forced to publicly clarify allegiances, stating that if a choice had to be made between the United States and Denmark, the choice would be Denmark, NATO, and the European Union, and it was not provocation, it was survival. It was a reminder that sovereignty is not something granted by powerful neighbors. It is protected through law, alliances, and collective resolve. The White House response did not calm the situation. It escalated it. Trump dismissed Greenland's leadership, questioned their legitimacy, framed resistance as a problem that would need to be dealt with, language that sent shockwaves through diplomatic channels across Europe. Because that language wasn't negotiation, it was coercion. And when coercion is aimed at an ally, alliances begin to fracture. Here's what makes this crisis so dangerous. Greenland already hosts U.S. military infrastructure, missile defense systems, strategic radar installations. The United States already has access. There was no security gap. There was no emergency. There was no strategic necessity. So when Trump insisted the U.S. needed Greenland, the explanation collapsed under scrutiny. What remained was something far more unsettling: ownership. Donald Trump has said it himself. Ownership matters to him psychologically. Land is not about governance or people. It's about scale, symbolism, legacy, how something looks on a map. That real estate mindset has now collided with a global order built on treaties, norms, and restraint. And that collision has consequences. Those consequences became visible when European nations, Denmark, Germany, France, Sweden, Norway, deployed forces to Greenland under Operation Arctic Endurance. Officially, it's a joint exercise. Privately, it's a signal, a message that borders are not up for renegotiation by threat, even when the threat comes from a longtime ally, even when it comes from the United States. And this is where the story stops being about Greenland alone, because for the first time since NATO was created, allies are quietly preparing for the possibility that Washington is no longer a stabilizing force. That realization is seismic. In Brussels, Copenhagen, Berlin, and Paris, the conversation is shifted, not how do we coordinate with the U.S., but how do we protect ourselves from volatility coming from the U.S. That is not anti-American sentiment. That is risk management. And once that psychological shift happens, it does not reverse easily. Inside the United States, the reaction has been just as revealing. Democrats have openly called the escalation reckless and dangerous. But the deeper story is the discomfort spreading quietly among Republicans who understand what this really means. Violating NATO commitments is not controversial. It is catastrophic. Because the moment the United States is seen as an unreliable partner, trust erodes. Investment dries up. Markets react. Insurance premiums rise. Long-term capital hesitates. And those costs don't hit elites first. They hit working people. This is happening while Americans are already struggling. High prices, stagnant wages, crushing debt, unaffordable housing. Against that backdrop, the idea of spending hundreds of billions, potentially close to $1 trillion, pursuing territorial ambition feels disconnected from reality. And that's because it is. This crisis didn't come out of nowhere. It was built slowly, through normalized chaos, through the lowering of expectations, through the repeated insistence that extreme rhetoric doesn't matter until it does. Now NATO troops stand watch on Greenland's icy terrain. The cost of complacency is no longer theoretical. It's operational and visible. This isn't just about Trump. It's about whether the post-World War II order can survive leadership that treats alliances as leverage, sovereignty as a transaction, and military force as a branding tool. Because once allies start hedging against American unpredictability, the global system begins to realign, quietly, irreversibly. And this is only the beginning. To understand why NATO's response to Greenland matters so much, you have to understand how extraordinary it is for an alliance like this to move at all without a clear external enemy. NATO does not deploy forces casually, it does not improvise, and it certainly does not reposition troops based on headlines or rhetoric alone. Every movement signals calculation. So when European defense ministries agreed to move personnel into Greenland under Operation Arctic Endurance, they weren't reacting to a single Trump statement. They were reacting to a pattern of behavior that had crossed from unpredictable into destabilizing. Behind closed doors, officials weren't asking whether Trump meant what he said. They were asking what happens if he acts on it. That's a crucial difference because allies can survive rhetoric. They cannot survive uncertainty about intent when the speaker controls the most powerful military on earth. For decades, the defining feature of U.S. leadership inside NATO was reliability. Allies didn't always agree with Washington, but they trusted that treaties mattered, that lines would not be crossed casually, and that disputes would be handled within established frameworks. That trust is now under strain. When Trump framed Greenland as something the United States was entitled to, not something to negotiate for, not something to discuss diplomatically, but something that was unacceptable not to control, it forced allies to confront a scenario they had avoided imagining. What if the United States no longer treats alliance borders as settled? That question alone is destabilizing, because NATO is built on the assumption that members do not threaten each other's territorial integrity. The entire logic of collective defense collapses the moment that assumption is questioned. European leaders understand this deeply because their continent was shaped by what happens when borders become bargaining chips. That historical memory matters. So while public statements remained calm, measured, and diplomatic, planning accelerated quietly. Contingency meetings were held, legal frameworks were reviewed, defense coordination intensified. Not because Europe believes the United States is about to invade Greenland tomorrow, but because alliances plan for low-probability, high-impact risks, and an unpredictable ally with unmatched military power qualifies. This is why NATO's language has been so careful. Officially, these are exercises. Officially, these are routine. Officially, nothing has changed. But everyone involved understands the signal. This is reassurance for Denmark. This is deterrence for escalation. This is preparation without provocation. And preparation tells you how seriously this is being taken. At the center of it all is a psychological miscalculation that has defined much of Trump's approach to foreign policy. Trump views pressure as leverage. Allies view pressure as threat. Trump believes strength comes from dominance. Allies believe strength comes from predictability. Trump thinks everything is negotiable. Alliances depend on things that are not. That mismatch is now visible in real time. And the most unsettling part is how quickly this has shifted from theory to action. Just a few years ago, the idea of NATO preparing defensive deployments because of U.S. rhetoric would have sounded absurd. Today, it's happening quietly, precisely to avoid panic. That alone tells you how far the ground has shifted. Meanwhile, the rhetoric from the White House has only hardened. Instead of recalibrating, Trump has leaned into grievance. Instead of de-escalating, he has framed resistance as disrespect. Instead of acknowledging sovereignty, he has dismissed legitimacy. That's not diplomacy. It's intimidation. And intimidation does not work inside alliances built on voluntary cooperation. What alarms national security experts most is not just what Trump says publicly, but what his words authorize privately. Because when a president openly mocks allied leadership and questions their right to say no, it lowers the barrier for escalation. Not necessarily through invasion, but through pressure campaigns, economic coercion, or military signaling that slowly normalizes the unthinkable. History shows us that geopolitical disasters rarely begin with dramatic announcements. They begin with leaders convincing themselves that rules are optional, that treaties are obstacles, that allies exist to comply, that power is proven through defiance. This is why Greenland is different from previous controversies. This isn't about tariffs. This isn't about sanctions. This isn't about bluster toward adversaries. This is about the implied willingness to coerce an ally, and that changes everything. Inside Europe, this has triggered a quiet recalibration. Defense cooperation independent of Washington has accelerated. Strategic autonomy discussions have intensified. Contingency planning no longer assumes automatic U.S. restraint, not as an act of rebellion, as an act of prudence. European leaders are not trying to replace the United States. They are trying to hedge against volatility. That distinction matters. Because once hedging begins, influence shifts. Trust becomes conditional. Coordination becomes cautious. Dependence becomes a liability. And those shifts don't reverse quickly. Back in Washington, the political response reflects the same tension. Democrats have framed this as reckless escalation. But more telling is the quiet discomfort among Republicans who understand the legal and economic implications. Violating NATO commitments is not a policy disagreement, it is a constitutional and treaty crisis. The NATO treaty was ratified by the Senate. It carries legal force. Any attempt to coerce a member state or undermine its territorial integrity without congressional authorization crosses red lines that cannot be smoothed over by rhetoric, and lawmakers know it. That's why you're seeing hesitation rather than enthusiasm, silence rather than support, deflection rather than endorsement. It's not courage, it's fear. Fear of confronting Trump publicly, fear of alienating donors, fear of acknowledging reality. But reality has a way of intruding, especially when markets are watching. The economic implications of alliance fracture are enormous. Global markets are built on trust in stability, predictability, and rule-based systems. When the United States signals that even its closest alliances are subject to impulse, that trust erodes. And when trust erodes, capital moves, investment slows, risk premiums rise, borrowing costs increase. Those effects don't stay abstract. They show up in mortgages, in credit cards, in job markets. That's why this crisis cannot be dismissed as a distraction. Distractions fade. This has momentum, it has structure, and it has consequences that compound over time. And as NATO forces settle into their positions in Greenland, the question facing the world is no longer whether this moment matters. It does. The question is whether there are still enough institutional guardrails, enough political courage, and enough collective restraint to prevent further escalation. Because once allies begin preparing for instability from Washington, the center of gravity of global leadership shifts, quietly, but permanently. To understand why Greenland has become such a dangerous flashpoint, you have to look past strategy charts and military briefings and confront the psychology driving this moment. Because this fixation is not rooted in defense needs. It's not rooted in alliance gaps. It's not rooted in international law. It's rooted in ownership. Donald Trump has said this openly, repeatedly, and without irony. Ownership to him confers power in a way treaties never can. Possession is permanence. Control is validation. And scale is proof of greatness. That worldview makes sense in real estate. It is catastrophic in geopolitics. International systems are not built on possession. They are built on consent, predictability, and restraint. Treaties exist precisely to prevent powerful actors from converting desire into domination. And that is why Trump's language about Greenland has set off alarms far beyond the Arctic. When he dismisses Greenland's elected leadership, he's not just being rude. He's signaling that legitimacy flows from strength, not from democratic consent. When he frames refusal as a problem, he's not negotiating. He's implying consequence. That implication is what forced NATO's hand. Because once a leader begins speaking about allied territory as something to be taken rather than respected, the alliance must assume that words could eventually become actions. Not tomorrow, not openly, but incrementally. That's how international crises actually unfold. No single dramatic invasion, just pressure, just normalization, just reframing. And Greenland's geography makes it uniquely vulnerable to that kind of pressure. It sits at the crossroads of the Arctic, a region growing more strategic as ice melts and shipping routes open. It hosts critical infrastructure. It matters militarily, economically, and symbolically, which makes it the perfect target for a mindset that equates possession with power. But here's what that mindset ignores. Greenland is not a blank space. It is not unclaimed. It is not a prize. It is home. And when powerful nations begin treating inhabited land as an asset rather than a society, history shows where that leads. That's why European leaders reacted so decisively, because for them, this is not theoretical. Europe remembers what happens when borders become negotiable and leaders believe they can redraw maps by force or threat. That historical memory is not abstract. It is lived. So when Trump's rhetoric hardened, Europe didn't argue publicly. It prepared quietly. Operation Arctic Endurance wasn't about muscle flexing. It was about reassurance and signaling. Reassurance to Greenland and Denmark that sovereignty would be defended. Signaling to Washington that escalation would not be met with passivity. This is deterrence without confrontation. And deterrence only works if it is credible. That credibility comes from presence, which is why troops are on the ground. This is where the narrative often gets distorted. Some will say NATO is overreacting. Others will claim this is routine. Both miss the point. Routine exercises don't follow public threats. Routine deployments don't coincide with sovereignty disputes. Routine planning doesn't accelerate this quickly. What's happening here is risk management. Alliances plan for worst-case scenarios not because they expect them, but because failing to plan is irresponsible. And from Europe's perspective, the worst-case scenario is no longer unthinkable. That realization is the real crisis, because it changes how allies view the United States, not as an anchor, but as a variable. Variables introduce uncertainty, and uncertainty reshapes behavior. Inside European defense circles, conversations have shifted from reliance to redundancy, from automatic coordination to independent capacity, from trust-based assumptions to contingency planning. This is not a rebellion against America. It's a response to unpredictability. And unpredictability at the top matters more than ideology. This is why the economic implications are so severe. Global markets are not ideological. They are pragmatic. They respond to signals. And the signal being sent right now is that even alliances ratified by treaty can be destabilized by personal ambition. That erodes confidence. And when confidence erodes, money moves. European leaders understand this. So do investors. So do central banks, which is why this moment intersects so sharply with everyday life, because the costs of instability are not paid by presidents or prime ministers. They are paid by workers, families, and small businesses. Higher borrowing costs, slower investment, more volatility. This is how foreign policy decisions hit domestic wallets, and that connection is finally becoming visible. Back in the United States, this has begun to expose fractures that were previously masked by party loyalty. Some lawmakers are starting to grasp that Greenland is not like other controversies. This isn't rhetoric that can be waved away. It directly implicates treaty obligations that Congress itself ratified. Violating or undermining those commitments isn't just politically risky, it's legally explosive, which is why the reaction on Capitol Hill has been muted rather than supportive. Silence instead of applause, process instead of endorsement, concern instead of celebration. This mirrors what we've seen in other areas where Trump's impulses collide with institutional reality. Leadership tries to slow him down without confronting him. They reframe statements as hypotheticals. They emphasize procedure. But that strategy only works for so long, because the more Trump pushes, the more visible the resistance becomes. And the more visible the resistance becomes, the more the illusion of unified authority cracks. This is what makes the Greenland crisis different from past distractions. It has endurance. It cannot be spun away easily, because militaries are involved, treaties are implicated. Allies are reacting. And once allies begin recalibrating, the effects cascade. Another underappreciated aspect of this moment is how symbolism is being weaponized. Maps shared online, images depicting Greenland as American territory, casual jokes that normalize annexation. These may look juvenile, but they serve a purpose. Symbols shape perception. Perception shapes consent. When people are repeatedly exposed to imagery that treats territory as negotiable, the idea becomes less shocking. That's how normalization works. And normalization is dangerous when applied to sovereignty, because it dulls resistance before action ever occurs. For Greenlanders, this has been deeply unsettling. Their voices are often sidelined in coverage that treats the island as a chessboard rather than a society. And yet they are the ones whose future is being discussed as an abstraction. That's why their leadership's response was so firm. Not hostile, not provocative, but clear. They reaffirmed their place within Denmark, NATO, and the EU. They asserted dignity. And dignity is not something you negotiate away. The fact that this had to be said publicly is itself a warning sign, because stable systems don't require constant reaffirmation of sovereignty. Only unstable ones do. As this situation unfolds, the risk of miscalculation grows. Militaries operate through signals. Exercises send messages. Deployments create assumptions. And the more crowded the Arctic becomes with overlapping forces, the greater the chance of incident. Not because anyone wants conflict, but because uncertainty breeds error. This is precisely what alliances are designed to prevent, which is why this episode strikes at the heart of the post-World War II order. That order was built on the idea that power would be constrained by rules, that alliances would replace coercion, and that security would be collective rather than transactional. Trump's approach challenges all three. And that challenge is not abstract, it's unfolding in real time. Inside policy circles, there is growing concern that this episode could become a precedent, that future leaders may feel emboldened to test boundaries, assuming allies will always adapt. But adaptation has limits, and once those limits are reached, systems break. The Greenland crisis has not yet reached that point, but it has moved closer than many are comfortable admitting. And the most sobering realization is how easily this could have been avoided. All it would have taken was restraint, respect for sovereignty, an understanding that power is most effective when it is trusted. Instead, the world is being asked to adjust to volatility, and volatility is corrosive. By the time NATO troops completed their initial deployment rotations in Greenland, something irreversible had already happened. Not on the ice, not in the barracks, and not even in classified briefings, but in how the world now understands the United States. For the first time since the alliance was created, America is no longer viewed solely as the stabilizing force that holds the system together. It is now viewed as a variable, and variables change everything, because global order does not run on intentions. It runs on expectations. For nearly 80 years, the expectation was simple. The United States might argue, pressure, or negotiate, but it would not threaten the territorial integrity of its own allies. That assumption underpinned trade, security, diplomacy, and economic coordination across continents. The Greenland episode cracked that assumption, not shattered it completely, but cracked it enough that contingency planning became necessary. And once contingency planning begins, trust quietly recalibrates. Inside Europe, this recalibration is already underway. Leaders are no longer asking whether Washington will respect alliances. They are asking how to function if Washington becomes unreliable in moments of stress. That question is reshaping defense budgets, intelligence coordination, and long-term strategic planning. Not publicly, not dramatically, but decisively. European defense integration, once slowed by reliance on U.S. guarantees, is accelerating. Strategic autonomy is no longer framed as optional. It is being treated as insurance. And insurance is something you buy when risk increases. This shift matters because it changes America's role in the world from indispensable partner to powerful but unpredictable actor. And unpredictability does not inspire loyalty. It inspires hedging. Hedging means diversification of defense, diversification of supply chains, diversification of political alignment. Those shifts don't make headlines, but they shape decades. This is where the true cost of the Greenland crisis begins to emerge, because credibility, once lost, is not easily regained. You can rebuild bases, you can renegotiate treaties, you can change administrations, but rebuilding trust takes time and consistency. And consistency is the one thing volatility destroys. Inside the United States, this reality is colliding with domestic pressure in ways that cannot be ignored. Americans are already struggling. Housing costs are crushing. Healthcare remains unaffordable. Debt is widespread. Wages lag behind prices. Against that backdrop, the idea that national energy and resources are being diverted toward territorial ambition feels not just disconnected, but insulting. People understand trade-offs instinctively. When they see military escalation abroad while life becomes harder at home, they ask a simple question: who is this really for? And the answer they increasingly arrive at is uncomfortable. Because the pursuit of Greenland was never about security gaps or alliance weakness. It was about symbolism, about size, about ownership, about legacy. Donald Trump admitted as much when he framed ownership as psychologically necessary for success, a revealing statement that collapses the entire strategic argument. That admission matters because it reframes the crisis as one driven not by necessity but by impulse. And impulse is the enemy of stability. History shows that most systemic breakdowns do not occur because institutions fail suddenly. They fail because they are slowly strained by leadership that treats norms as obstacles rather than guardrails. That is the pattern unfolding now. Trump did not invent this instability, but he has accelerated it by normalizing the idea that rules are flexible, treaties are transactional, and alliances exist to serve personal ambition rather than shared values. Once that mindset takes hold at the top, it filters downward. Advisors adjust language, allies adjust posture, markets adjust risk, and everyday people adjust expectations. That adjustment is already happening. Polls show rising skepticism about foreign entanglements, growing concern about leadership credibility, increasing frustration with governance that feels reactive rather than deliberate. This is not ideological backlash, it's fatigue. Fatigue with chaos, fatigue with escalation, fatigue with promises untethered from reality. What makes this moment uniquely dangerous is that it sits at the intersection of global insecurity and domestic strain. When those forces combine, the margin for error shrinks. A single miscalculation can cascade. A single incident can escalate. A single assumption can prove fatal. And that is why NATO's response to Greenland is so restrained yet so serious. They are trying to prevent escalation by preparing for it. They are trying to reassure without provoking. They are trying to deter without accusing. That is a delicate balance, one that becomes harder to maintain when rhetoric continues to inflame rather than de-escalate. Inside Washington, the cracks are becoming harder to hide. Lawmakers are receiving briefings that outline worst-case scenarios, not to alarm them, but to ground them. Those briefings make clear that even symbolic violations of treaty norms carry real costs: economic retaliation, alliance fracture, Arctic militarization, loss of diplomatic leverage. These are not abstract risks. They are measurable outcomes. And once policymakers confront those realities, neutrality becomes untenable. That is why Greenland is different from every controversy before it, because this is not about messaging, it's about structure. The post-World War II order was built on the idea that power would be constrained, that leadership would be predictable, and that alliances would be based on mutual respect rather than coercion. That system is now being stress-tested, not by an external adversary, but by internal volatility. And the outcome of that test will shape the next generation of global politics. If the United States continues down a path where alliances are treated as optional and sovereignty as negotiable, the world will adapt. It always does. But adaptation does not favor instability. It favors redundancy. It favors decentralization. It favors caution. And in that world, American influence does not disappear, but it diminishes, not because of defeat, but because of mistrust. That is the quiet cost of this moment. No invasion may ever occur. No borders may change. No treaty may be formally broken. And yet something has already shifted. Allies are recalculating. Investors are watching. Institutions are bracing. And citizens, both abroad and at home, are asking whether leadership still understands the difference between strength and restraint. Greenland may never become American territory, but the damage done by treating it as a prize rather than a partner will linger. Because in global politics, credibility is not built through dominance, it is built through reliability. And reliability is fragile. Once broken, it leaves behind a world that is more cautious, more fragmented, and less willing to trust even the most powerful nation. That is the true story beneath the headlines, not ice, not territory, not even Trump alone, but a global system quietly preparing for the possibility that the country once tasked with stabilizing it may no longer be able or willing to do so. And when that preparation begins, history tells us one thing with certainty: the world does not wait.